Okay, I'm here again with Paul Ress on January 3rd, 2010 in Arlington, Virginia. And Paul, I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how you came to work for Time Magazine.
Well, I guess I got to work for Time Magazine mostly by losing my job several times ahead of time. I had worked for the Herald Tribune, for the United Press, which in those days was UP, not the United Press, International, UPI. And then I worked 8 years for the Chicago Tribune in Paris. And then I lost my job for about the third time. And I also worked for Canadian Broadcasting. So I had to go to the States to look for a job. Well, I got one of sorts. I got a job on the copy desk of the New York Daily News. Now, the New York Daily News had the fastest, smartest copy desk, I think, going. And I was soon I realized that I was above my head. I thought I'd win some prizes, and I didn't because they were so good. Boy, they were good. And at that point, I decided I didn't want to be a copy reader for the rest of my life. I wanted to be a reporter. And so I went back to, well, I went into Time and looked for a job, and I saw a man with a nice name, Dudley Darling. And Dudley Darling said, "You shouldn't be looking for a job here. You don't know New York City. Do you know Paris?" I said, "Oh, yeah, that's where I've been living." They said, "Well, go ask the people in Paris at Time for a job." So I went back to Paris. I walked into the Herald Tribune first and saw Eric Hawkins, the man who had fired me, but who liked me. And he said, did you work for a newspaper guild shop at a place where you had guild rates?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, no, we couldn't afford to hire you here in Paris for the Herald Tribune. So much for that one." So then I walked into the Herald Tribune, to the Time Life, which had a big office on the Place La Concorde. And there I found Art Bookwall and Frank White and Curtis Prendergast and someone else and a photographer playing gin rummy. And one of them looked up and said, "What are you here for?" That's when I said, as usual, "Well, I'm looking for a job." And then they said, "Well, we don't really have any jobs. We've got about 15 people in the Paris bureau. We can't get 15 stories a week into Time or Life." I said, "Well, what about that job in the Riviera?" So they said, "Oh, do you want that one?" So I said, "Oh, yes, I want that one." So I was promised $200 a month minimum sum, no matter how much I produced. I said, $200? I could hardly live on that, even on the Riviera. Couldn't you make it 300? I didn't see very big. And they said, "Well, we'll have to ask New York," which I rather doubt they did. But about 2 weeks later, they called me up and said, "Yeah, we can guarantee you $300 a month if you work for Time on the Riviera." So down I went to the Riviera eventually with my wife, 3 children, 2 boxer dogs, and 2 Siamese cats. And it was really very nice on the Riviera, as you can imagine. I did 10 film festivals at Cannes, and the weather was wonderful, and Graham Greene lived in Antibes, and I got to know him, and little by little I sort of worked my way into the Time circuit, and I got a lot of stories published. But I had a foreign editor who didn't think much of me, and I didn't like him very much either, Murray Gart. So he called me to New York and said, "You've got to come to New York to work, or you haven't got a job." Oh, I said, hold on. And I said, "I have 3 children." And he said, "I don't care about your children." I said, "I know that, but I care about them." So I said, "I'll have to think about this, about working in New York." I had no intention of going to New York. And he said, "You've had enough time to think. You better tell me right now whether you're going to work for Time in New York or not. If you don't, you haven't got a job." So I said, I'm rather like Jack Benny, I'm thinking. And he said, "You've thought enough." I said, "That's what you say, but not me. I think I haven't thought enough." So then I ran into the managing editor, Henry Grunwald. And I said, "Henry, I've just been told I have to come to New York." He said, "Well, you'd like it here." I said, "Maybe, but I like it better in Paris, and I know French, and You once told me, Henry, I got more stories into the magazine at a time than anybody who wasn't in a war zone. You remember that? He said, yes. Would you like it here in New York? He said. He said it 4 times. The 4th time he said, you like it here in New York, I knew I was doomed. So I said, well, I'm going back to Paris. I went back to Paris, and of course, 2 weeks later, I got a letter saying, your services are no longer needed. I had no money, no savings, had a lot of people depending upon me, and, well, it was a grim period. I had an arrangement with Time that guaranteed me 6 months' salary. So I worked for 5 months on that 6 months' salary, and I had 1 month to go, and then I finally got a job with the United Nations Environment Program in Geneva, and that saved me from jumping into the Hudson River or whatever, or the Seine in Paris. I was pretty desperate, but things worked out, and it's probably the best thing that happened to me that I left Time. Look at the magazine today; it's pretty thin, not much in it, and they don't really know how to compete with the emails and the internet and electronic journalism. So, better off not being a journalist.
When you were working for Time, you wrote not just for Time, but you wrote also for Life magazine and for Sports Illustrated. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. Sports Illustrated was great fun. I liked that. I think I could have had a staff job at Sports Illustrated in Paris, which would have been a good thing, better than Time, because they were really gentlemen at Sports Illustrated. It was more than I could say for everyone at Time. They were kind and they were reasonable, but I didn't know that I wanted to write about golf or tennis or rugby all my life. I wanted to write about politics and about people. So I didn't make an effort to be a full-time sports correspondent. It was probably a mistake, but one makes mistakes.
Now, at Time at Sports Illustrated, they allow bylines,
Oh yes, I got a lot of bylines at Sports Illustrated.
and
And they liked jokes and puns, and that was rather satisfying because in over 15 years at Time magazine and writing two stories maybe a week, I found I got 11 puns published in 11 years. So I was batting 0001, and whereas at Sports Illustrated, they liked big stories and long stories. So I wrote the first story about the Aga Khan, about Karam Aga Khan, the younger one, and it took me 9 months to do the story. I went all over the world with him, practically all over Europe, and that was great fun. It was better than Time in that sense. You could write witty stuff if you had it in you, and you could propose stories and propose ideas, and they were open to them. Time was difficult. In 15 years at Time, I got one health story, one medical story in the magazine, one, and I had to fight for that one.
in Time magazine, did they allow bylines?
Sorry?
Did they allow bylines at Time?
Very rarely. They had what they called inside bylines, so they would quote you in the story as saying, and Time correspondent Bill Jones said so-and-so. That's the kind of a byline you'd get, but you wouldn't get an overall byline, no.
Now, I've